So about Glocalities, just briefly, since 2013 we are operating globally and we're conducting international research. We move beyond the, well, oftentimes regular measuring of just numbers and percentages, because we want to know the depth behind the perceptions of people, also behind trust. And in that way, we use psychographic, cross-cultural measurements, and we look at values foremost, the social values of people. That's what we relate with measures of trust, for example, with their behavior and their preferences. So, and in the name Glocalities, it's tying up the global and local, based on actually social intelligence that we are gathering, knowledge about cultural differences and cultural values, which we think is highly relevant. So I see there are some people in the lobby. Lindsay, maybe you can let them in. Is that possible? So this is the program that we will have for today. We have 5 waves of global research in place already since 2014. And the data points that we're going to present now are based on our most latest wave, early 2020. And as stated, we go beyond just polling numbers, but we look also at the values behind it. So these are some of the instruments that we use for understanding cultural differences, understanding audiences. So we look at value segmentation, trends, politics, sustainability, and we take a holistic stance in doing the analysis, which you will see later on when I present the report. So this is the report that we will be presenting today, in which we find that the United Nations is more trusted than other governmental organizations globally, and also dig deeper into the audiences who are the actual carriers of trust in the United Nations. And we present this in the light of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations that was founded upon the ruins of World War II. And that's also what Samuel Zipp will later on reflect upon as a historian. So the main outcomes of this survey is that half of the world population say they trust the United Nations, and there is only 3 out of 10 people globally state that they do not have trust in the United Nations. That's different when you look at, for example, trust in the US, or trust in Parliament in general, trust in government in general. The percentages of distrust are much higher. And you see here as well that while the US is often seen as a world leader, trust in the UN is much, much higher. And that's also an interesting fact, I think, with the incoming Biden administration and the post-Trump era that is coming in. We will find later on, and I'll explain that why people trust the UN is much more layered than often is thought. Because oftentimes there is a thinking that you are either a globalist or a nationalist. And we see that actually that is not the case. The people who trust the UN transcend this polarization that is sometimes paralyzing societies. The data for this research were gathered early this year in our annual Glocality study in 25 countries, and these countries are mentioned below in this slide. So when we look into the carriers of trust, the advocates of trust in the United Nations, we see that these people actually are proud of the flag of their own country, so they are well rooted in their own countries and consider themselves world citizens. So this is transcending the polarization that is sometimes paralyzing countries. If we look at the UN support base, the advocates of UN trust have generally a greater interest in politics than people who don't trust the UN. They believe in business ethics, they are concerned about the environment, they are open-minded and tolerant, and they have a mindset of networking. and working together instead of competing with one another. Trust in the UN is high amongst all age groups, and then it differs between 45 and 50%, so it doesn't vary much, but amongst the youngest generation, 18 to 24 years old, trust in the UN is highest, and distrust in the United Nations is lowest. And that's, I think, quite interesting to dig into. What we also see is that if you look at the global figures, and in the report that is live at our website, www.glocalities.com/UN Trust, that's where you can download the report, you will see that in South and East Asia, on average, trust in the United Nations is highest. However, that in all other countries, the UN also scores very high when you compare the United Nations with government in general, with parliament in general, or with international institutions such as the European Union or NATO. If you look at the people who do not trust the UN, this is also very interesting to see that those are people who tend to be more disillusioned and nostalgic, feel lack of perspective. They feel disconnected, they feel lack of control and let down by society, but they are not necessarily nationalist in their views. So this is another dichotomy, another axis. It's whether, on the one hand, people feel connected and embedded in a greater structure, and also believe in working together, versus people who tend to feel themselves let down and nostalgic and sometimes cut off from others and from society. So people who believe in the United Nations believe also in unity and feel united, whereas people who don't have trust in the United Nations tend to be more disillusioned and feel disconnected, which is something different than being a globalist or a nationalist. And that's an important learning from this study. Also, when we look at the emotions that people generally experience, and we use the PANOS scale for this, the positive and negative affect scale that's used widely in psychological research, we see that people who trust the UN tend to thrive emotionally. And what is known from psychological research is that positive emotions broaden one's awareness and encourage exploration and variety. And that fact helps build skills over time. If you are experiencing positive emotions more often, you also are more likely to have a bigger picture thinking and the ability to think holistically. And whereas on the other hand, if you experience negative emotions for a lot, your perspective of course narrows down to immediate survival needs, and also sometimes competing over resources and stress. That's what's happening. Actually, positive emotions also increase the probability of finding good in future events, and also in finding unity in diversity. So what we see here is that if you look at the United Nations as a concept, as a purpose, as a goal, as an ideal, culture and emotional maturity is really key. And it's an institution that has the potential to help people work together and encourage that, and also foster a culture of cooperation, of achievement, of inspiration, and bigger picture thinking, instead of people feeling isolated. And of course, there are very good reasons for people to experience negative emotions. But I think that the United Nations and the whole thinking behind this is also about the potential of humanity and how to unlock that, and how to facilitate that, and how to help humanity thrive and overcome negative emotions and survival. So that is something that is really interesting and something that we learn. So when we look forward, building upon these findings, we see that the UN is highly trusted. 75 years after its founding on the ruins of World War II still. Much more so than, for example, the United Nations, of the USA, the United States of America. The advocates of UN Trust are positive thinkers and doers who take the lead, and they recognize the UN potential. They are also more able than others to work with differences in belief systems and values, and the vision of cooperation, of interdependence and unity that the United Nations embodies fits their aspiration and values, and that is also why the United Nations is so appealing to them. And it's not necessarily so that the United Nations is living up to all those ideals, but it is also that the purpose and the ideal of the United Nations is an attractor to people. People really look up to it. People feel that there is a need. And the people who trust the United Nations score higher on social responsibility, tolerance, taking responsibility, combining national pride with international cooperation. So this is, I think, an internationally interesting audience that also takes the lead and is generally younger and also able to overcome the paralysis of polarization in countries. So the survey reveals a timely opportunity to revitalize the United Nations as a platform for fostering cooperation and communication about solving international challenges in an increasingly interconnected world. But then, for doing so, it should not be the foremost platform for power play, because that's not what these people are into, but the platform for cooperation, recognizing the interdependence of nations instead of the division between nations or even divisions within nations. So this is a brief summary of our research. So now I propose to go on with the reactions to the study, and after that there's room for questions. And first I will give the floor to Michael Sheldrick from Global Citizen. He is a Chief Policy and Government Affairs Officer, and he will also bring us the quote from Ban Ki-moon, the reaction from the former UN Secretary General, under whose rule the Paris Climate Agreement came into place, and also the Sustainable Development Goals,